Well, I've been fortunate that I haven't been able to hold a job for a long time. Okay, I've done a lot of different things. I was a university professor at American University before joining the Central Intelligence Agency. And my first year at the agency, I was in what they called a career trainee program. One of my classmates, Valerie Plame, later went on to gain some notoriety in the start of the Iraq War in 2003. But I wound up as the Honduran analyst, later senior regional analyst. Then I got fed up with what I'll call just the terrible management at CIA. That just incompetent management is probably the easiest way to describe it. And was offered a chance to. I'd been briefing regularly Morris Busby, who's was the ambassador at large for the Central American peace process, and he had just been named the ambassador for counterterrorism in the counterterrorism shop at State. If anybody's watched the Netflix series Narcos, so in Narcos, and one of the seasons they have Ambassador Crosby. Well, that was Busby, because Buzz was the ambassador later in Colombia when they went after and caught Pablo Escobar. So I moved there and worked in the counterterrorism shop for 4 years. And then I got downsized because coming in the Clinton administration said, we don't need as many people on the counterterrorism side. And so I began consulting. And so my consulting career, which is now about 30 years plus, involved doing money laundering investigations and scripting exercises for U.S. military special operations forces. I did that for 23 years. So over the course of this, what happened is I wound up with experience on the operations side of the CIA, on the analytical side of the CIA, on the policy-making side at State. I handled transportation security, both maritime and aviation, so I got expertise into those areas. And then I worked closely with the Pentagon in the course of 23 years doing military exercises. So I'm one of those individuals that's unique in the Washington, D.C., because most people end up stovepipe. They end up being only at one agency and they only have that one perspective. I got sort of the broad view and could see how all the different parts plug together. You know, the parable of the 9 blind men with the elephant, each is filling a different part. Well, I got to take the glasses off and see the whole elephant.
And what would you say you saw?
That the bureaucratic imperatives often end up ruling the day. We like to think that in the world of James Bond, whether with Pierce Brosnan or any of the other famous Bond characters, that they sit down and they think through it rationally. Who's the best person? How can we get this done? And they're operating from good information. And what I discovered was, no, instead of, it's not that. Are you familiar with the cartoon character Dilbert?
Yes.
That's the CIA. Okay. That's this Dilbert. It's not 007. And decisions made based upon petty personal politics at times, financial interests, but no broad view of strategy, and definitely not thinking things through. Saying if we do this, then the other side's likely to follow up and do that, and then we need to be prepared to do X, Y, and Z. None of that kind of thinking. Occasionally it happens, but that's very rare. More often than not, we're just stumbling into affairs, worried about immediate actions without thinking through the consequences.
Very interesting. One of the things that Julian Assange said, and I've played this video over and over on my show. I think people are tired of seeing it, but one of the things that he said is that the goal is not necessarily to win the war. It's to continue to, launder money and to keep this system going. And I think when we look back at something like Afghanistan, for example, people say 20 years, in Afghanistan and what was accomplished there. I think that's where a lot of Americans get it wrong. They think the goal is to win, and that's not always the case.
Well, having lived in Washington, D.C. for 40 years, so moved there with my wife in 1979, and we finally pulled chocks and got out of there in 2019, moved to Florida. When we arrived, we first lived in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and then later Silver Springs, Maryland, and then Bethesda, Maryland. When we got there in 1979, you didn't have any Lamborghini, Ferrari, Bentley, Rolls-Royce dealerships. They didn't exist. A luxury car at that time was considered a Mercedes-Benz. 40 years later, you had Lamborghinis, Ferraris, Bentleys, Rolls-Royce. What happened in that intervening 40 years? While there's always been corruption and lobbying and lobbyists, it took off like a nuclear bomb under Bill Clinton and was continued under George W. Bush. In fact, it as bad as it was under Clinton, when it got to George W., man, it went on steroids. And so all of a sudden, jobs that used to be done in-house at CIA. So as an analyst, by the time I left, I was making close to $100,000 a year. And what the CIA ended up doing is they took jobs like mine, subbed them out to contractors. Only now, instead of paying me $100,000 a year, they're paying this contractor $300,000 a year to get the same job. So all of a sudden you're tripling, quadrupling the costs. And you had a lot of people, both at my agency and at Department of Defense, who went, hey, you know what? I take my knowledge, I go out to this private contractor. SAIC is one of them. They've got, they just proliferated. They call them Beltway bandits. And then you get the Lockheed Martins and the General Dynamics and the Boeings, et cetera, Raytheons. And they take their government expertise because they now know who to call. They can call their buddies back inside the Pentagon or back inside CIA or State Department, and they get contracts funneled to them. And then all of a sudden you get this, it's like musical chairs, except the chairs in the Congress, the chairs in the executive branch, the chairs in the private sector, the chairs in the media. They're all switching, they're all moving, but it stays within. It's a form of incest. Normally when human beings engage in this kind of conduct, it's illegal. They put you in jail. But in Washington, they promote you.
There you go. There you go. And that brings me to Russia and Ukraine. So this war has, in my opinion, lasted longer than I think many would have predicted it would last. But recently, Vladimir Putin apparently has announced a temporary ceasefire. Putin declares unilateral 3-day ceasefire in Ukraine after being accused of violating the Easter truce. So there's a number of questions I think that people are asking about this particular war with Ukraine. Number one, why a temporary ceasefire? I think a lot of people that are anti-war have been calling for a permanent ceasefire, just end this altogether. And then number two, what do you think is happening here with Donald Trump? Because remember, he promised, I'll end that war on day one. Those two questions for you there. Why temporary ceasefire, not a permanent one? And what do you think is happening with Donald Trump? Is he struggling to get this resolved?
Okay. So with respect to the ceasefire, I had the chance of interviewing Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, 1st of March, a little bit over a month and a half ago. Sat down at a table across from him, great guy, very smart, very well-spoken, very intelligent. And he made the point that every ceasefire that Russia has entered into, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, they had even negotiated a ceasefire with Ukraine in March 29th of 2022. And the United States, along with Great Britain, with Boris Johnson in particular, came in and blew that up. And so on every single ceasefire that Russia's agreed to, the West has broken it. So they no longer trust any kind of ceasefire. In fact, what they saw was the ceasefires were used to build up Ukrainian military capabilities. So the ceasefire that Vladimir Putin announced for May 9th, 10th, 11th, that is in conjunction with the celebration of the Great Patriotic War, the war that the Soviet Union won with the help of the United States and Great Britain. But it was the Soviet Union, now Russia, that fought and destroyed the Nazis. They fought the bulk of the Nazi army. For every 12 Russian citizens that fought, one died. Compare that to what happened in the United States. 2/10 of one out of 100 died in that war. So the United States paid no cost in blood. But now let's come to Donald Trump. I'm sure you've heard him the last couple of days that, man, I don't know nothing about this war. This is all Joe Biden and Barack Obama's fault. That's a lie. So let's look. I've just done at Sonar 21, a 3-part series that looks at the history of the buildup to war in Ukraine by examining the role of NATO and U.S. military exercises with Ukraine over a 33-year period starting in 1992. From 2011 to 2021, January of 21, we only had 2 presidents during that time frame. One was Barack Obama, one was Donald Trump. What happened during the course of those military exercises in that decade is, number one, at the start in 2011, Ukraine only had an army of 200,000 with a reserve force of 329,000. In the course of that decade, through the military exercises that the United States and the United States through NATO were conducting with Ukraine, Ukraine's army by 2021, right after Donald Trump left office, was 250,000, but the reserves had grown to 900,000. These were NATO-trained forces. They had been trained by NATO, by the United States. In other words, Barack Obama and Donald Trump grew the Ukrainian military by a factor of 4, from 330,000 to basically 1.2 million. That's number one. Then in 2017, who was president then? Yeah, that would be Donald J. Trump. So what did Trump do? Under him, Operation Sea Breeze, which was an annual maritime exercise conducted in the Black Sea, shifted from what would be called purely defensive operations to, they specifically announced they were doing anti-submarine warfare and amphibious warfare. Amphibious warfare means you got U.S. Marines in landing craft that are going on to beaches, they land and they get off firing their guns. They want to claim that these were defensive military exercises. Nonsense. We didn't call our landings at Tarawa, at Guadalcanal, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa with landing craft defensive operations. Those were offensive. That was under Donald J. Trump. 2020, September. Who's president? Donald J. Trump. And they approves B-52s flying along the coast of Crimea. So, can you imagine how we would react if Russian strategic bombers were flying along our border with Mexico? We would lose our friggin' minds. So Donald Trump wants to pretend now that I don't know nothing about, birthing no babies. No, his hands are as bloody and dirty as, he wants to blame it on Barack Obama and Joe Biden. But yeah, there's lots of blame to go around there. But Trump is just as guilty. In fact, he brags about, I sent Ukraine javelins. Those are offensive weapons. And Barack Obama just sent blankets. So Trump needs to cut this nonsense and pretend that he's the innocent, that he's a neutral mediator here. Russia does not trust him. They appreciate the fact that now he's come out and acknowledged, Crimea belongs to Russia and NATO shouldn't have done what it did. But we can't escape the fact that the NATO buildup against Russia, a large portion of it occurred under his term.
Why do you think more Americans either forget that or just don't realize that? Because when Biden was president, there was a lot, I'm sure you remember when Biden was president, a lot of people, especially those of us that are anti-war, were like, this war needs to end. This is crazy. Like, what are we doing here? But I noticed again, like once Trump became president, even some of the anti-war voices that were saying Trump is going to resolve this Ukraine, disaster, have started making excuses for Donald Trump and saying, well, he's trying his best, but this isn't his war. This was Joe Biden's war. Do you think people just didn't realize that, or you think they did realize it, but they don't want to acknowledge that Donald Trump his hands are just as dirty?
No, they've been lied to repeatedly. I don't think most people realize it. That's why, that's why I published it at my, I got a small blog, Sonar 21, but try to get the information out there. The information's there. It's not easy to find. I really had to do some digging for it. But once I uncovered it, it was like, holy smokes. Here's another sort of fun fact. NATO by 2008 had a total of 28 members. During that decade, 2001 to 2010, who was president? Well, we had George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And as you notice, I'm being bipartisan in this. It's not blaming one party or the other. They're both to blame. And I asked one of the AI, artificial intelligence search engines, where did the majority of the military exercises take place? Who hosted the most NATO and U.S. military exercises in Europe and in Eastern Europe during that decade? Answer came back, Germany, France, but number 6 was Ukraine, number 7 was Georgia. Well, guess what? Ukraine and Georgia were not official members of NATO. So you're telling me that during that decade, out of 28 NATO countries, only 5 hosted exercises that were NATO countries. The other 2 were non-NATO countries. So this was part of a Western effort to expand NATO in order to confront and ultimately defeat Russia. That information's been out there, but people just aren't paying attention to it.
That's interesting. But they're not actually defeating Russia. They implemented sanctions on Russia. Russia's economy still seems to be doing pretty well.
Yes.
What happens here? Because I do not think that the U.S. government will defeat Russia, even like in the future. Yeah. Right. So then the only alternative in my mind is to make peace with Russia and try to see Russia as a partner, as a collaborator, similar to what you see happening with BRICS, these countries that decided, let's work together, let's try to have a multipolar world. I mean, at some point, I think the U.S. government is going to have to stop painting Russia and China as the enemy, and they're going to have to say, you know what, we need to try to work together with you. Do you think that will ever happen, and why or why not? Well,
I'm hopeful it will happen. I think somebody needs to send him the Four Tops song, Just Walk Away, Renee. Yeah, he needs to walk away. That's what he needs to do. Because Donald Trump right now, he's the one that can bring an end to this. Without U.S. financial support, without U.S. intelligence support, without U.S. material support, without the presence of U.S. military and intelligence advisors in Ukraine, that war can't continue. All he's got to do is walk away. Now, Russia has made it very clear. They hope for the chance to develop friendly relations, renew friendly relations with the United States and with the West. But it's the West that has been attacking and killing Russians, not the opposite way around. Russia doesn't have 700 plus military bases scattered around the globe. That's us, the United States. Russia hasn't conducted 2 invasions of Iraq in the last 30 years, invasions of Syria, invasions of Afghanistan, invasions of Libya, invasions of Somalia, invasions of Panama. We just go down the list. So the one that's been the military aggressor in the world has been the United States, not Russia. So Russia would like to live and let live, mind its own business, just stay away from us. Sergei Lavrov today, it was interviewed in Brazil by their version of the New York Times. It's called O Globo. And he was very, very direct. He repeated what President Putin delivered to the Russian Foreign Ministry more than a year ago, or almost a year ago, in June of 2024. He said, one, Ukraine's got to lift its legislative ban on negotiations with Russia. In September of 22, Zelensky said it's illegal for anybody in Ukraine to talk to Russia. So you got to get rid of that, number one. He said, second, Ukraine can never, ever become a NATO member and must remain neutral and non-aligned status. That means no more hosting NATO exercises in Ukraine. Third, Russia wants to overcome the laws that have been put on the books in Ukraine that make it illegal for Russian language, media, culture, traditions, and religion, the canonical orthodoxy, to go on. That has to be lifted, that Nazi oppression of that. Then recognize all of the 4 territories that Russia has incorporated based upon referendum: Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, along with Crimea, which is already part of Russia. And that has to be internationally and legally recognized as part of Russia. Then he says all of Kiev's obligations have to be legally secure. They've got to have enforcement mechanism. They've got to be permanent. And you've got to lift the sanctions on us in Russia. You've got to remove these lawsuits and warrants that are outstanding, like the International Criminal Court accusing Vladimir Putin of child trafficking. And do all that, yeah, then we can have peace. Russia has not backed off of this 1 inch in the last 11 months. And they keep thinking, oh, we'll just send Steve Witkoff over. He's going to do a quick tap dance with Vladimir Putin, and we're going to compel him into a ceasefire. It's not going to happen. What Lavrov said today is exactly what Vladimir Putin said June 14th, 2024, to the foreign ministry senior officials in Russia, in Moscow. The West we're not listening. They're speaking. They're making it clear what their demands are, and we keep pretending, they don't mean that. I've been fortunate. I've been to Moscow and Russia 4 times, 3 times to Moscow, once to St. Petersburg since December of 2023. Russia is a strong, vibrant economy. It is a free country. They have re-embraced their religious nationalist roots. And the United States just better pray to God that it never gets into a fight with Russia, because they will beat us, and beat us decisively.
If this war were to end this year, like let's say Donald Trump pulls this off and the war ends this year,
yeah,
what do you think happens to Zelensky after that?
He'll be lucky to survive. The one leverage that Trump would have is to tell Zelensky, listen, here's the deal. Here's what you agree to right now. You agree to the Russian demands. Pull your troops out of those 4 oblasts. Lift the ban, and lift and reverse all this legislation that is attacking and destroying Russian culture. You do all that, I guarantee you'll have your beachfront housing in Vero Beach, Florida. It's where you can go retire there, or we'll ensure that you get your place down in the Mediterranean. Otherwise, the door is going to be closed for you. Cooperate or else. That kind of leverage.
Do you think that, let's say the Democrats were to win in 2028, could you see them reversing what this is the question that I've had for quite some time. If this war does end under Donald Trump's administration, what's stopping the next administration from coming in and saying we have to go after Russia again?
Oh, well, no, you're absolutely right. There's nothing to stop. Well, what's going to stop them is the fact that the United States does not have the industrial base to confront Russia. We really thought that we could put sanctions on Russia and that their economy would collapse. You really had just the ignorance in the United States about the current state of Russia is phenomenal. It's dramatic. It's stunning. It's so bad. So go back to there's a paper written by the Rand Corporation in 2019, and it's basically outlining how to put pressure to weaken Russia. That was followed up in December of 2020 by a guy named Wes Mitchell. And Wes Mitchell had been he'd been a senior diplomat under Donald Trump, and he was basically saying, "Look, we face a future where if China and Russia become strong allies, that's going to be dangerous for us, the United States, because it'll threaten our ability to control the world. So we got to come up with a strategy to weaken Russia or split Russia off from China." And the strategy he came up with was basically use Ukraine as a battering ram, start a war with Russia, defeat Russia, and then Russia in its defeat will be forced to come crawling to the West for help and assistance, and then they can become our ally as we go after China. They really wrote this stuff. And I'm happy to send you a link to the paper. Well, guess what? That plan didn't work out so well. Turns out that Russia is the number one country in the world in terms of natural resources. It does not need a single thing from the United States or from any other country in order to produce everything it needs. It used to buy airplane engines, say, from Boeing. But now with the sanctions that were imposed, Russia's making its own airplane engines. And so now trade that used to happen between the United States and Russia on items like that, no longer happening. Russia's established a domestic commercial airline industry, and they're going to be selling jets that'll be cheaper, more inexpensive, not cheap in quality, but they will be inexpensive relative to what the United States and the French charge for Airbus. And they'll be selling it to countries in Africa and countries in Asia. And the Chinese have come along and helped produce a lot of those planes. And so there is a partnership now between Russia and China that didn't exist prior to this effort to start this war with Russia to tempt them, provoke them into attacking Ukraine. So I've actually come to the conclusion that Joe Biden ought to get a Nobel Prize for bringing Russia and China together in this partnership and alliance, because it's not only changing the world, it's going to be a fundamental change in the world, that the United States will no longer be the hegemon running things.
Do you think that Donald Trump would receive a Nobel Peace Prize if he ends this war in Ukraine?
Potentially, but if he ends the war in Ukraine let me put this: the only way the war in Ukraine will end is on Russian terms. Okay, there's no negotiated settlement. You'll hear people like Rubio saying, "Oh, both sides have to make concessions." No, the Russians don't have to make concessions. When you own the property and when you own the bank account, you don't have to give up the property and bank account just because someone tells you have to. Now, Trump may get the Nobel Peace Prize by signing a new agreement with Iran that will cap Iran's nuclear enrichment program and take away the prospect of war in the Middle East. That very well could happen. That's a deal that the Russians are willing to help Trump make. But the war in Ukraine, I believe, will end as a military victory by Russia. It will be negotiated as an unconditional surrender by Ukraine. And the West will have if the West decides that they want to intervene, the West will be destroyed. It's that simple. The Russians, for example, they got at least three variants of hypersonic missiles: Kinzhal, Iskander. United States, we don't have one that's been deployed and is operational. Not one. We like to brag that we had this great advantage in the space, in outer space. Nonsense. United States since 2004 was relying on the Russians to fly our sorry rear ends to the space station because Elon Musk hadn't shown up yet to do it for us. So we're way behind on a lot of the space technology issues, but militarily, what Russia has demonstrated and learned during the course of the last 3 years, 2 months now that this war has raged, is they have defeated every single U.S. military system that was deployed to the battlefield: HIMARS, Attack missiles, Patriot missiles, Javelins, drones, M1 Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles. They've destroyed it. They've defeated it. And remember that the major counteroffensive that was supposed to have that was launched in June of 2023, that was planned entirely by the U.S. military in Germany, Chris Cavoli, and with the help of the Brits. Now, that wasn't a Ukrainian idea. That was a Western idea. They got beat. That idea that they launched it, they got whipped. So this war is not going to end with negotiations. It will be the kind of or the negotiations that will take place will be here's your surrender document, sign the bottom line, or we'll continue to kill you.
And that brings me to the Middle East, because you brought up Iran. What do you think is going to happen with Gaza? Donald Trump came up with this idea of Trump Gaza. I don't know if he was trying to troll people or what, but obviously it wasn't funny. Of the U.S. taking over Gaza or being in control of it. There's no real ceasefire. Israel is still continuing to attack people in Gaza. I saw a video yesterday where there was another tent that they bombed. So it's like a drawn out starvation or a killing spree that Israel was still participating in. Now, some of the voters that were in Dearborn, Michigan, Donald Trump went to Dearborn. Kamala Harris didn't. I think that was a mistake. But he went to Dearborn and he was able to convince some of them that he was going to fix this issue. And obviously, I didn't believe that, but some people did. And that's not the case. People are still starving in Gaza. There hasn't been food that has entered. And I think last time I checked, we're going on 50 days going into Gaza. So what is happening here? I feel like Donald Trump played his hand at this particular situation way too ambitiously, because I don't really think Donald Trump had an answer to solving the genocide in Gaza. I think he just said what he thought people wanted to hear. I want to get your take on that.
Well, he has the power to solve it. Again, all he's got to do is turn off the military aid to Israel and say, this is going to stop. You're going to negotiate. Trump now is caught. He's caught in a quagmire because, number one, the internal divisions in Israel are growing. They're becoming sharper. Netanyahu right now is trying to attack and destroy the head of Shin Bet. That's like the head of the FBI. And the head of Shin Bet is fighting back. And because the Shin Bet has developed credible evidence that Bibi Netanyahu and his subordinates are taking payoffs from the government of Qatar in order to, maybe change the deal that was going to be cut with Hamas. So there are open talk of a civil war in Israel. The Israelis are overstretched. Let me use the analogy that let's say that you decide, instead of just having a house, you live wherever you live, that you say, you know what, I'm going to go get me a beachfront property up in Maine. Then I want to go down and get some beachfront property in Florida, and then I'm going to get me a mountain house in Colorado. So all of a sudden now, but you haven't changed your income. So you still got the same income, but now you got that house in Maine and the house in Florida and the house in Colorado to take care of. Well, you get stretched thin like that, you're going to run into a lot of stress, a lot of financial problems. That's exactly what's taking place with Israel right now. Their military is a reserve force, and they're not a volunteer force. Everybody's got to sign up, but they got a limited number. You're talking a country that's only 8 million people. Number one. New York City's larger than that. So then they're fighting in Gaza. They're fighting in the West Bank. Now they're also fighting up in Lebanon, and now they're fighting in Syria. And at the same time, the number of reservists that are showing up for duty is dropping. They're saying, no, this war's got to stop. Many senior military commanders have come out protesting and writing open letters declaring that Netanyahu is prolonging the war in order for his own personal political benefit. Then the fighting has intensified over the last couple of weeks in Gaza, and the Hamas is killing Israeli soldiers again. They're ambushing them. They're setting up pretty clever ambushes. I saw a video of a sniper the other day, killed 3 Israeli soldiers, shot the first 2. Another one comes up to render medical assistance, and he gets shot. So Israel cannot afford to sustain those kinds of losses. And they're certainly not united domestically. So with that as the backdrop, Trump is under, the Zionists in this country, and this includes Christian evangelicals who have, completely sold themselves out to the Zionist lies, are putting a lot of pressure on Trump to stay the course, to destroy the Hamas. I mean, my God, we heard Mike Huckabee, claims to be a Christian, but he's talking about starving the children of Palestine to death the other day with not one bit of regret, not one show of emotion. So Trump's he's got a potential way out here, and that is if he agrees to the deal that Witkoff looks like is on the verge of negotiating and sealing with Iran. And Iran is willing to do that deal because they've signed a new strategic partnership with Russia. Iran's in a much stronger position today than it was, 10 years ago when they first brought on the JCPOA. And some people claim that they're in a much weaker position, but I'll be happy to argue that point. They're in a stronger position now, both militarily, but more importantly, with their relationships with not only China and Russia, but now they've reestablished diplomatic ties and have a good working relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Wow. Why do some people think that Iran is weaker today?
They look and say, they got driven out of Syria. Well, Syria was, all they went into Syria to really do was fight against ISIS. ISIS is the one we've supposedly fighting against, which says, wait a second, that should have made the United States and Iran allies in the fight against the radical Islamic Sunnis. Well, no. We continue to lie and present it's verifiably false claim that Iran's the number one sponsor of terrorism in the world. It's absolutely not true. It's empirically not true. I can show it to you with the State Department's own documents, own data that's produced by the intelligence community. So they've insisted that Iran is isolated. But let's just compare and contrast. In 2015, Iran was isolated. China and Russia were both imposing sanctions on Iran along with the other countries. Iran was starting to get bogged down in a war in Yemen, where they were backing Ansar al-Ansala, the Houthis, and they were fighting Saudi Arabia. They were bogged down in a war in Syria, where they were fighting ISIS, and again, doing this on their own. They were isolated economically back then, and so it's really no worse today. Well, let's look at the situation today. Today, since 2019, so 7 years, they've been conducting annual military naval exercises with Russia and China together. That's number one. They just signed a comprehensive strategic agreement with Russia, which covers military, intelligence, economic, diplomatic, and international trade routes. Because one thing that Russia and Iran are working on is what's called a north-south transport corridor that runs from basically the Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean, up north into Russia. A major economic corridor that, from Russia's standpoint, takes away all the choke points that it faces right now, having to sail through either the Dardanelles in the Black Sea or up through getting out of the Baltic Sea into the Atlantic Ocean. So here's Iran now with a firm partnership and not just a pat on the back, but they're getting military equipment, they're getting military advisors, and they're getting full intelligence sharing. So from that standpoint, Iran's in a much stronger position. Their last election was actually a very competitive election, and let's say the moderates, Pezeshkian won out over the hardliners, barely, but he won out. And so Russia is doing everything it can to cultivate that relationship with Iran. And Iran right now is willing to make a deal with the United States that it will not build a nuclear weapon. They'll provide the guarantees. All it is up for Donald Trump to do is accept the deal. And on paper, he should accept it. That way he'd be able to claim, hey, I have brought peace with Iran. They're not building a nuke. We've got an entire system of verification in, and there's no time limit on it. But I can't rule out that Trump's going to walk away from that and listen to these crazy Zionists and insist that Iran's got to do things that Iran will not do. Iran's not going to destroy its missile force. Iran's not going to end its peaceful nuclear program. And Iran is not going to cut off relations with Hamas, Hezbollah, or the Houthis.
Yeah, and that all makes sense. And if I was Iran, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying, yeah, I'm going to get rid of all of these things, even though Israel still has powerful.
Yep.
It doesn't make any sense. That kind of just opens the door for Israel to come right in and attack Iran. You would be defenseless.
Right. Well, remember, Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi tried that. We promised, hey, man, give up all those chemical weapons you have and all those biological weapons and any work you're doing on nukes. And hey, you'll be our best friend. You get to sit with us at the lunch table. And Gaddafi did that. A few years later, we're invading him, and he gets assaulted in the most vicious way with a sword stuck up his back end, and it killed him.
Yep. Yeah, I think a lot of countries have learned, no, we cannot trust the United States government, especially when it comes to anti-war issues. When we're talking about Israel, I noticed there was a new poll that was released recently that shows the majority of Americans actually do not support Israel anymore. That's the first time I've seen that. And I think that Israel does realize that they've lost support. And remember, under Biden's administration, Biden said the conversation that he had with Benjamin Netanyahu is, hey, Israel's losing support, was trying to sound the alarm. And now, here we are. I think as many times as we bring up AIPAC, because I talked about AIPAC a lot, another one that you brought up, the Christian, Zionists, the evangelicals, there's also the Kufi, which there's a lot of money that's donated there as well. So I think AIPAC is kind of the easy target, but people have to understand that there are multiple lobbies to support the state of Israel. Yes. And I honestly just wonder how long that's going to hold, considering the new poll that was just released.
Well, yeah, this is a generation gap. So people who are my age, so I'm now 70, we've got living memory, which you're well under 50, that you don't have. You didn't grow up with the movie Exodus with Paul Newman, and it was all about the beleaguered Jews coming out of the Holocaust, going to Israel, and it had all these the good Arabs, and they were all welcoming the Jews, and everybody dancing a hora together, and and then to the movie's credit, it did actually portray the role of the Irgun and Stern Gang, which were terrorist organizations, Jewish terrorist organizations that used campaigns of terror against the Brits to try to secure the right. But we grew up with this because the movie ends. They had this blonde Danish girl. Her character's name was Karen, and she was a sweetheart. Everybody, you fall in love with her. She's so adorable. Well, she's murdered and raped by those nasty Arabs. It was sort of the Mandingo thing, and it was racist. Then it was designed to portray the Arabs as these vicious rapist thugs. And so we grew up with this image of Israel as the little David, and the Arabs as the monster Goliath, and little David fighting against Goliath. Well, the truth was otherwise. what we haven't been told, and what actually some of the evidence just came out with the release of the Kennedy files. John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert F. Kennedy were trying to require AIPAC and its predecessor organization to register under FARA because they recognized they were violating FARA. They were representing a foreign government and using political money to direct the U.S. political process. They sent a letter to AIPAC, predecessor, 1 month before John F. Kennedy was killed. Kennedy was also directing an investigation to find out how Israel had stolen out of Pennsylvania, out of a place called Numek, the radioactive material that was used to construct the first bomb. He was trying to prevent Israel from proliferation. There is credible evidence that we now saw in the latest release of the JFK assassination files that a senior CIA officer by the name of James Jesus Angleton, who was working closely with Mossad to stop President Kennedy's orders, to stop President Kennedy's lawful orders from being carried out, and to circumvent that and help Israel get the bomb. And there's credible evidence that James Jesus Angleton, along with elements out of Mossad, they had direct ties into the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And people say, oh, that's far-fetched. Well, the documents that just came out actually buttress that. That's one of the reasons they've been sitting on them for so many years. It points the finger. And then what happened? Once Lyndon B. Johnson took over, there was a complete reversal in U.S. policy towards Israel. And because LBJ was compromised, which we then get to the attack on the USS Liberty, which was covered up. So the Israelis were allowed to attack a U.S. ship and to kill U.S. sailors, and no consequence came of it. So despite this, the people in my generation that grew up with this benign version of Israel as the little David, not the fighting Goliath, your generation, fortunately, is starting to see it for what it is. Israel's the Goliath. The Palestinians are the David. They're the ones who are virtually unarmed. They're the ones being killed. I can show you the statistics that the Israeli Foreign Ministry has collected since August of 2000 through present day. And excluding what happened on October 7th, let's just take it up through 2023, excluding October 7th, during that 23-year period from 2000 to 2023, only a grand total of 1,575 Israelis died in terrorist attacks by Palestinians. Now, I'm not saying that that's an insignificant number, but that's over 23 years. That's not a lot when you consider, we lost on 9/11 alone, we lost close to 4,000 Americans and other foreigners. So it gives a big lie that because Hamas is alleged to have killed 1,255 Israelis on October 7th, that justifies Israel killing 52,000 plus Palestinians, most of them civilians. Not justified at all. And most 17,000 children counted in those numbers. So this is, the Zionists and their Zionist lobby. That's one of the reasons they want to get rid of TikTok, because TikTok helps the word get out. And, that's why they try to shut down podcasts like yours and others. When you have the integrity and the courage to just allow the truth to be told. They're not a benign state. They're not a great democracy. They are right now engaged with a war of genocide against the Palestinian people, and left unchecked, they may carry it off.
Yeah, that's the very much unfortunate part. And I'm so glad that more people have woken up to what's really happening over there. And you're right. I think a lot of people people believe what they were told. Right. And I think for the longest time, it's interesting. Not too long after October 7th, there were a number of people that told me they didn't even know that Palestinian Americans existed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some people told me they didn't even know what Gaza, they had never heard of Gaza.
Well, and then you get these you've got a number of Jewish students and Jewish professionals. I mean, Max Blumenthal, he's Jewish. Jeffrey Sachs, he's Jewish. And yet they're being accused of anti-Semitism. Dave Smith, he's Jewish. They get accused of anti-Semitism for speaking out about the crimes these Zionists are committing. And, unfortunately, Donald Trump has been all over the board on this. There was some hope, 2 months ago when he retweeted Jeffrey Sachs' presentation before the Oxford Student Union in England, in which he referred to Bibi Netanyahu as a deep, dark son of a bitch. And Trump retweeted that. And people were like, wow, great. He's at least acknowledging what Netanyahu is. But then, you get his comments this last week. Oh, I just talked to Bibi, man. We were 100% in agreement on everything. So, yeah, you're 100% in agreement with a guy that's murdering children on a regular basis and starving them and allowing that to go on. So, like I said, Trump's all over the board on this. We'll see if he allows this peace negotiations with Iran to come to fruition. I'm hopeful, but I'm also realistic. I never underestimate his ability to miss an opportunity.
And some people have said behind the scenes that Donald Trump doesn't want any of this to happen. Colonel McGregor, Colonel McGregor, he posted on X that behind the scenes or privately, Donald Trump doesn't agree with any of these, what's happening in Ukraine or what's happening in Gaza. And it's just like, he would need to publicly say that.
Absolutely. And I was critical of Pope Francis, the recently deceased, because, part of the problem was he's old and infirm. Okay. So we're an old sick man and he can't really walk, granted, but you still got the ability to send other people to do stuff. And he didn't come out strongly condemning the genocide that the Israelis were carrying out. He could have set papal envoys along with aid convoys to go to Gaza, but papal envoys to go stand in front of the churches that the Israelis were bombing, because we're just destroying mosques. They were destroying some of the oldest Christian structures in Gaza. And the Israeli military was shooting unarmed Christian women who were in their 50s and 70s, for God's sake. They didn't represent a threat. And so, he didn't do that. He actually sort of sided with Ukraine in the war against Russia, and whereas the Ukrainian government was persecuting Christians in Ukraine, but they were Eastern Orthodox Christians, so they weren't really Christians as far as the Pope was. So that's what I say. You've got people in these world leadership positions with the capability to speak out and make a difference, and he didn't. He didn't make a difference. And then, when he dies, they want to shine him all up, polish him all up, and man, what a great man! This is a great leader. Oh, blah blah blah. Please, all I can see is the body counts in both countries, and he did nothing to help stop that.
I think he waited too long to say what's happening in Gaza is not a war. I think he waited too long to say that. But to your point, there's other things that he could have done. Like they were talking about it on the news about, I think it was Al Jazeera was covering this, about how Pope Francis was talking to people in Gaza every day. And I'm like, that's good. But talking to people when you had the power to do more, that's not the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's like you're on the Titanic and we got a phone connection. And I say, hey, Sabby, how's it going, girl? Are you a good swimmer? I mean, how does that help you? That doesn't help you. It'd be, I'm sending a boat, we're flying a plane. Well, be there, hang on, we're coming. That would be something, if it's that kind of talk. But it wasn't that kind of talk. It's like, man, I'm with you in solidarity. In fact, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go drop some ice in my bathtub, and I'm going to sit there in the middle of that cold water, and I'll be thinking of you. How does that help you? Doesn't help you at all.
No, it doesn't. Larry, one more question for you. Since you've moved to Florida, it has to be a completely different world for you, like leaving DC. I feel like every time I go to DC, it's just a different place. And my family originally is from that Maryland, Virginia
Oh,
area.
yeah.
But DC, I feel like there's a certain bubble there. Everybody I know that lives in DC either works for the government in some way, shape, or form. But more importantly, like I remember even mentioning like third party to people, some of my friends that live in the area, and they're like, what are you talking about? There are no other parties. Like it's a totally different bubble.
Yeah, yeah. Listen, Florida, um, the street I live on, I have never been in a neighborhood like this. Uh, I know all but say two or three of the neighbors on the street. There's constant communication, constant conversation. There's a genuine, willingness to reach out and help each other. Um, like back when I lived in Bethesda, I knew my one neighbor to the next door. He was the largest defense lobbyist in town, by the way. And the guy, the guy's wife was always calling me to come over and fix stuff because he was incompetent at it. There was one time that they had a dead battery in their car and he didn't even know how to jump the car to get it started. So I was that helpful neighbor. But what you find out here is a level of friendliness. And yeah, it is down here. It's more, it's more Republican as opposed to Democrat. But there's a lot more freedom, a lot more responsibility for yourself. It's just, but you know what? I admit it. I don't like shoveling in snow and raking leaves. But I like it down here when the idea of winter is when it turns 45. That's considered like Arctic conditions. All right.
I know it's always funny to me if I whenever I go down south and I see people wearing like boots and it's like 65 degrees outside.
Actually, my first year in Florida, so I became a Florida resident in 2009. But my wife still had another 10 years to work at the National Institutes of Health as a nurse manager. And the first year, so it was January 2010, and they're getting ready to play the Orange Bowl. And University of Iowa was in town in Fort Lauderdale to play the University of Miami. And you could tell who was from Iowa and who was from Miami. So all the Miami folks are walking around. They had the Uggs on and, they're wearing coats with some fur collars and, maybe a hat or two, even some gloves. All the Iowa people were out there in shorts, wife beater shirts, flip flops, running up and down the beach. It's just, a little bit different perspective. What Florida thought was cold, Iowa thought was springy, almost summer-like. So, you get accustomed to it. I'm just happy that we avoid some of the craziness that you're just allowed to make your own decisions without a lot of, I'm not sure what the terms left and right mean anymore. I just judge it by, do you mind your own business or not? I don't care whether you're government or my next door neighbor or my mother-in-law, God rest her soul. Keep your business out of mine. I'll keep my business out of yours, and we'll get along just fine. Now, is that liberal or conservative? I don't know. I just know that, if we respect each other and give each other some space, we can have a lot better life as opposed to feeling that we've got to meddle in everybody else's business. I mean, candidly, that's been the problem with the United States for the last 70 years. We feel like we got to go meddle in every damn country around the world. And we wonder why we're trillions of dollars in debt when we've been spending trillions of dollars overseas on all these foolish wars. Meanwhile, you go to Moscow. When Vladimir Putin took over in 1999, he made sure Russia didn't get embroiled in any foreign wars. They spent all that money on their people, on their infrastructure, on their cities. Good Lord. You walk into their subway stations, you think you've walked into the Louvre, a museum of art. They're incredible. The streets are clean. You don't hardly see any police on the streets. Go to like New York City and walk down Fifth Avenue. You're going to see cops every 2 blocks. Try that in Philadelphia. Good luck. But the cleanliness, the friendliness of the people, and I don't know how the Russians did it, but they're not burdened with the history of racism. They're not burdened with that. They start checking out the color of people's skin first. They just like, okay, yeah, so you got darker skin than I is. The Africans that come there, the Asians that come there, they get treated as equals. There's no sense of condescension, no sense of being treated like you're something else other than a human being. And that's what's made Russia, successful diplomatically. That is genuine. I've seen it up close and personal. And, it's something I think that we in the United States could learn from them.